Mission here. All right.
All right. Hello, climate friends, and welcome back to another Power Lunch episode in the 1000 Conversations About the Future series. This is a project of the Ithaca Green New Deal, of course, that aims to engage you in a conversation about the future of Ithaca. As always, I'm your lovely and charming host, Rebecca Evans, Sustainability Planner with the City of Ithaca. And today we are expecting to cover what I think many would consider a contentious topic in the environmental world, and that's nuclear energy. Is there space and even social acceptance for nuclear energy, either locally, regionally, or nationally? And we're hoping to find some of that out by talking to two local experts. First, we have Dan Cogan, CEO of Dimensional Energy, and Ethan Bodnaruk, civil engineer with the City of Ithaca. Welcome, Dan. Welcome, Ethan. We're so lucky to have both of you join us, and really looking forward to this conversation. So I'm hoping that we can start with just sort of a brief introduction from both of you, maybe how you got into this type of work, the organizations, the type of work that you do within your organizations, and then kind of what got you interested in nuclear. As we mentioned, this is a really contentious topic, and you picked a side publicly.
Ethan, you want to go first?
Yeah. Thanks so much for having us here and for making space for this conversation. Like you said, it is controversial, so it's great to have the space to talk. So I am a civil engineer in the water and sewer department with the City of Ithaca. So I work with our water distribution system, sewer collection, water and wastewater treatment. That seems a little bit different than nuclear stuff, but it's my love for the environment, water and wastewater treatment, nutrient recycling is part of how I see myself as an environmentalist. And so I actually changed careers to get into this field. I worked in consulting in this field before, but before that, I had a few years stint with the National Nuclear Security Administration and non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So I did start off with a master's degree in nuclear engineering. And so basically how I got interested in nuclear in the first place was way back in chemistry class in high school, kind of nerdy, but that's what we're here to discuss, have fun with. So, like in chemistry class, all the reactions keep the same atoms. It's just different combinations of them. And we had a brief unit on nuclear, science and things like that. And that was the one kind of reaction that you write down, that the atoms themselves are actually changing. Uranium splits into two atoms that are half the size, things like that. So they're changing. And so, with my interest in the environment, that's kind of why I switched composting and just kind of learning about all the different environmental challenges we face and how engineers approach that gave me the passion to switch into the field I'm in. But, I've been involved and concerned about climate change for some time, and have been involved with Citizens Climate Lobby, which is working for like revenue neutral carbon fee, basically carbon pricing that's fair to the lower and middle income groups, and would really put a huge dent in climate change. And so through that group, I've been involved in that for years. And sometimes nuclear energy came up and people are like, oh, I don't know, what do you think? And I hadn't actually done the research into it myself to have a strong position. And it just kind of struck me as odd that I never sort of bothered, in a sense, to do that. And so I was like, I really should. And once I did some research, I found that a lot of the major scientific groups and organizations and studies out there, said that nuclear really needs to be part of the solution. And there's technical and economic reasons why. And that's kind of what spurred me to say, okay, like this is something, since I'm already concerned about climate change, and I believe that the science says nuclear needs to be part of it, I need to speak up on that. So that's my little spiel.
Wow, really interesting that you have that background. So my background, I also studied engineering. I have a master's degree in civil and environmental engineering. I worked for about 15 years, kind of in the energy energy conservation side of things, trying to reduce the amount of energy we're using. I worked for Tatum Engineering and doing like mostly building energy efficiency. And I also have been involved with, city politics. I was an elected city councilman for 10 years, and then was chief of staff for 5. I left the city back in May of last year. And then I recently, January of this year, started as the chief operating officer for Dimensional Energy, which is a carbon capture company. And we take carbon dioxide and convert it into useful products. Specifically, we're looking at converting it into jet fuel so that we can power aviation and not be producing, putting more carbon dioxide into the environment. So I will say I've pretty much been an environmentalist my entire adult life, from the time I was an undergraduate. And I think as part of that, certainly I was never like I never was like an anti-nuclear activist, but I think I just sort of assumed that nuclear was not needed. And then certainly as all the renewables have come forward and everybody has been promoting those, and I certainly have as well, that, renewables are really the answer. But I'll say that, like both with my work from Tatum, which, we've been pushing for years to electrify buildings and make buildings completely run on electricity. It's pretty clear we're moving towards an all electric future, cars, buildings, pretty much everything. And then also with carbon capture, I mean, in order for us to fix the mess that we've already made, we're going to have to pull a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that we already put there. And
that requires electricity, right?
Well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, pretty much all of it requires power. So, when I started working for Dimensional back in January, I also, started, listening to a lot of podcasts, climate podcasts. There's a lot of really good ones out there. And pretty early on, I came across, just like people talking about nuclear, and in a way that I had never really thought about before. And, and we can get into the details, but I mean, I pretty much will say that everything I've learned over the last 3 to 4 months, and I'm no expert, I mean, other than what the research I've done in the last 4 to 5 months, which will be interesting to have this conversation. But I will say that my mind has been completely blown open by all of the stuff I thought I knew about the health impacts of radiation and of nuclear accidents on the one hand, and then also just the problems with renewables, and the fact that they don't run all the time, and that as California has gone to more renewables, they've also increased the amount of natural gas they burn, and we can go into all that stuff, but it just really seems like nuclear is I mean, it runs all the time. It's, and we can go into it, but I mean, I've been kind of like feeling like we need to do nuclear, and I don't really see how we're going to fix the planet if we don't.
Hit the points. We're done. No, just kidding. No, I mean, what you said earlier about just kind of assuming that nuclear wasn't needed, like that's exactly how I felt years ago, and there was a little bit of conflict aversion, I think, in my personality, where I was like, oh, well, if nuclear is not needed, then why bother with it? But then I had to answer that question, well, is it? What's the science say on that? And, what are the real impacts surrounding that? And when I looked into it, I was like, oh, okay, it's a little different than I thought,
Right. Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say is sort of is like a disclaimer, like I don't have like all the facts at my fingertips, I really just started getting into this, and I plan to try to assemble more facts and figures so I can kind of quote better. But there's a ton of good information out there, and if people approach it with an open mind, because certainly if you approach it with the idea of like, well, I'm going to go and disprove all this stuff, or try to find somebody who disagrees with it and can disprove it, you're probably not going to take it in as much. But I went in with a very open mind, and I was like, wow. But but just right off the bat, like, I mean, what is it? Something like, I don't know, is it like 80% of the like renewable, or 80% of the non-carbon, electricity produced in the United States is like nuclear right now or something like that, you know? And so in order for us to take all the nuclear power plants that we already have running offline, you know, we would have to like, I don't know, is it double, triple, you know, quintuple the amount of renewables just to
catch up,
just to stay where we are right now.
Right. Exactly. That's something that, you know, I found that, like we're all saying, it's a controversial subject. A certain subset of folks of society is very, very anti-nuclear. I find that a lot of people are actually open-minded if they don't already have, you know, some sort of angle in the game, so to speak, or something. But yeah, sometimes, you know, I've been in a few public talks where if you can show graphics, something that's accessible, showing like really how much of our clean, you know, non-greenhouse gas emitting energy is nuclear, what happens when nuclear power plants shut down, you know, what happens if we did shut down all our nuclear, how much you'd have to catch up, you know, some just simple pie graphs and things. A lot of people do respond, you know, pretty well to that. It's compelling, you know. So I think examples like that are so important to highlight. You know, just here in New York State, the Indian Point nuclear reactors downstate shut down. There's 2 units there. One shut down in 2020, one shut down in 2021. And I have graphs and things like that because I have been doing this longer. So I've assembled some of that stuff and I can hook you up with some groups that we've got tons of all that. But yeah, it's really shocking, you know, just that one, just looking at 2019 to 2021 energy, nuclear power dropped from 33% to 25% of New York State supply, and fossil fuels went from 33 to 41%. So nuclear went down 8, fossil fuels went up 8. You know, it wasn't, renewables weren't catching up. You know, New York, we're trying to be, I think we're honestly trying to be leaders in the climate. The CLCPA is an amazing you know, law and act, but literally we're going backwards by kind of a lot, and that's shocking, and that should be more shocking to people.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's pretty sad. And you know, I mean, other two examples are California and Germany. You know, I mean, like California's moved into renewables, and you know, they've increased their natural gas use a lot because of the capacity factor of renewables. You know, the sun doesn't shine all the time. You know, sun's going down just as everybody gets home from work and, you know, and wants to turn on the electricity. So they've been burning a lot more natural gas and, you know, and buying a lot more electricity from outside the state that is, you know, is powered by fossil fuels.
Right. A lot of that's from Wyoming, and it's coal, you know, basically the imports. And sometimes these graphs, these charts, they say imports, but they don't say what those are, you know. So it's a way of hiding fossil fuels that are being used, you know. Right.
And Germany is like, I mean, now they're talking about, you know, of course, they've been denuclearizing for the last, you know, whatever, 8-10 years. And, you know, their fossil fuel use has gone up, and now they're talking about like restarting their coal plants, you know, because of what's going on with Russia and the natural gas and stuff, you know. So it's very disheartening, you know. And of course, I mean, at some point we should probably talk about the health effects, but I mean, but the other piece that like kind of like concerns me is the supply chain issues, you know, to like, even if, you know, I guess people who think that renewables can do it all, they'll say, well, yeah, you need wind and solar, and then you need storage, right? So you basically have to build 2 complete infrastructure systems, right? You got to build like the power generation system, and then you got to build a power storage system that's probably like as ambitious. And the amount of like, you know, rare metals that are required to do all that, and the places where they are, you know, like places like, you know, Russia and like, you know, the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's like, you know, and then people aren't in favor of mining generally. That's also mentally destructive. So it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Have you thought about that stuff?
Yeah, definitely. I can put it in the comments after this is done. This goes up, but there's this really great like 2 or 3 minute World Bank video about like all like the mineral needs for a clean energy economy, and they put a positive spin on it. But when the World Bank points out these challenges essentially of sourcing these rare, minerals and metals from different countries where there's a bad history of worker rights or, environmental conditions and things like that. It's this little video and it shows how much, like what percent all these different metals and minerals will need to increase by to meet different targets in 2040 and 50, and shows, that, like you're saying, it's like the DR Congo and things like that, in Russia, different places. So yeah, it's tricky. There's, sometimes like I find it's a tough string to thread, where like I definitely support renewables, and it's hard to sometimes communicate that well. People are, I found, eager to lump me into say I'm anti-renewable or something just because you point out some of the negatives, the environmental impacts of renewables. They're certainly great, but I feel like folks just don't have an understanding, if you're powering the whole world with them, just how much you need of it and how much storage you need, and like how inefficient batteries are at storing power compared to fossil fuels have 10 times the energy density, so 10 times more energy in the same mass or space than batteries do. And then uranium's like, literally a million times greater than that. So what's I think really special about nuclear and nuclear fuel is that you have that storage and you have that energy all in one item already.
Right.
And instead we're trying to spend gazillions of dollars, yeah, like you said, inventing both systems that have to be huge.
Right. Well, and that energy density is so important, and I think is hard to kind of really fathom, right? But and again, you probably have these stats more at your fingertips, but I think somebody I read that one pellet, one fuel pellet, that's like the size of your thumb, could power your house for 6 years, and your entire lifetime worth of energy use, would fit in whatever, a rod, 12 inches long or something like that.
Right. Or like a soda can. Yeah.
Yeah. It's crazy how dense that energy source is, and
there's a really interesting Twitter personality, Isabel Bemke. She's like a model in Brazil and got interested in climate change and nuclear power. And so she puts out these great, really creative videos.
Oh, is that the isotope?
Where isotope. Yeah. Where she shows a soda can size of nuclear fuel powering your entire life.
People should definitely find her on Instagram. I started following her on Instagram, and she's pretty funny, pretty cool, and makes really great points.
Right. So it's neat to have, I think us technical types, we definitely benefit when there's art and when there's just different things involved. Because it is hard to communicate these things well to the public sometimes, and that's what's sad. Like it's so easy to stir up fear in people, and it's so much harder to calm things down and present different facts and another side of the story, and that's a big challenge. And so to me it's just really sad. Like I worry that fear itself over a perfectly good solution that's really far safer than people think will really impede our chances, our ability to address climate change, and that's sad. And I think it's hard to really communicate that well. And folks grasp that sometimes,
Well, there are some pretty. I'll say some of the things that I saw that were pretty amazing. Like if you look up deaths per terawatt hour or deaths per gigawatt hour or something. Like how many, like for every, terawatt hour of electricity produced, how many deaths are there by fuel source,
Mm-hmm.
and nuclear is at the absolute bottom, I mean, like the top is coal and like then oil, natural gas, and but even wind and solar are higher than nuclear, and that's normalized by how many installations there are, and that it's just like, and that, I mean, there just aren't that many deaths from nuclear, and that, and that people who, like, well, I mean, getting into the health stuff, I mean, like a lot of people who study this stuff, like once they study it, they go in, people who went in like thinking that nuclear is bad, they study it and then they're like, oh, actually now I'm pro-nuclear, because they realize that, it's actually, we were kind of, honestly, I think we were sort of sold a bill of goods, I think that, and I've heard a little bit about the history of how we got to the place where nuclear energy was so vilified, but it really does seem like it got conflated with nuclear weapons,
Right.
And that
Right.
people sort of said anything nuclear is bad, anything atomic is bad. And then I think that some of the people who were opposed to it for whatever reason, they fed that conflation, right? They wanted people to kind of confuse the two and think of them all in one fell swoop. And that's
Right.
and that's partly, and that's just sort of permeated our culture.
Right. I've never experienced having to do nuclear bomb or raid drills or anything like that. I'm sure folks who went through that back in the day, or when, the height of the environmental movement was also an anti-nuclear weapons movement. And I think I've definitely talked to people who just, those are totally inseparable in their mind,
Right.
Good, very good people. And it's just, it's challenging, for them to see differences, but it's like, I don't know anyone who's against commercial air travel solely because there's also military airplanes and things like that,
Right.
like they're very different things, even though the technology is similar,
Right. Right.
So yeah.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about the health effects, because that's sort of where, like, that's clearly what people are most afraid of. Like, what you said that you would go door to door and talk to people. I mean, like, what do you tell people about health effects, or what are the biggest concerns, and how do you think about them?
Yeah, so I definitely haven't been door to door, but I am part of an organization, Nuclear New York, and we've been participating in the state's hearings about the Climate Action Council and going to those events all around the state. In 2017, when I was living in Syracuse, I was part of a public debate about nuclear power with AGREE, Alliance for a Green Energy Economy, that's very much anti-nuclear. That was my first public speaking debate. Debates are very rough. That's not fun for someone who's not like prepared for that style of things,
if you haven't,
with all the emotion and everything in this topic. But so I definitely have some experience with those things. But on the health effects, it really is radiation. You can't see it, so it's easy to fear and it's easy to stoke those fears. But like you said, the even Fukushima, exposures to significant amounts of radiation were very small, and deaths attributable to radiation are zero. So nuclear waste itself is radioactive, of course, but shielding is very simple, very understood. You have it in water, you have it in concrete, something like that. When we do transport nuclear materials, even for medical uses, we use a lot of radioisotopes for medicine, for industry, things like that. We know how to move things encased in gazillions of pounds of concrete, and they do tests dropping them on spikes and blowing them up with rocket fuel, and it's fine. So I think there's just not a good understanding that it's actually an advantage with nuclear power, that the waste you have is very small. It's very compact, it's contained, it's easy to store, easy to ship, and it's not going anywhere. All the rest of our wastes, we pollute directly into the air with fossil fuels. You know, things go to the dump afterwards and leach metals and things like that. You know, I would rather have all my waste in one little spot where I can monitor it and keep it safe, and nothing's going to happen to it, you know.
Right.
So that's something that, you know, is a totally different way of thinking about it, you know.
Right. Well, that's actually a really interesting point too, because, you know, like, you know, there's this one researcher or whatever that I've been watching YouTube videos. Her name is Jerry Thomas. Do you know her? She's like from the Chernobyl Tissue Bank. If you look up the Chernobyl Tissue Bank, you can find a link, and then there's a bunch of good videos there. But, you know, she talks about, you know, I think she was one of those people who kind of started out being kind of anti-nuclear. And then once she did all the research on what happened in Chernobyl, she became pro-nuclear, you know, because she realized how little of an impact it has. But, you know, she talks about how I think it was her who just talks about how way more concerned about like chemical exposures in the environment, you know, and than radiation exposures. And the thing about radiation is it does go away, right? Like over time, it disappears. Whereas like, you know, heavy metals are there forever, right? And like the things that we put, like the chemicals, the persistent chemicals we put into the environment may never break down, but radiation will, you know?
Right. And, yeah, exactly. I mean, people say, you know, if something has a 1,000,000-year half-life, it's sticking around for a long time. But the flip side of that is things with a 1,000,000-year half-life give off barely any radiation at all, right? So the bigger threat is something like lead in our paint. Lead sticks around forever. It never changes into anything else, you know, and we have far more exposure to things like that than we do to anything radioactive, you know? So lead is the thing that lasts forever and is a real like threat to human health, you know?
Yeah. Well, and part of the issue is, there's a part of the issue seems to be that, we can measure radiation down to almost infinitesimally small amounts, right? Like we can, you know, our sensors can pick up like one atom decaying, you know?
Right.
And so therefore, like if there's any atom at all that has just decayed, then it's like, it's too much. But interestingly, you know, there's radiation in all kinds of stuff that we eat every day. Like bananas, for example, have like, you know, like radioactive, potassium 40 and then, you know, and there's other foods that have like, you know, again, there's carbon 12 or carbon 14, I guess, which is another, you know, form. But like something like 85% of all the radiation that we're exposed to is just natural radiation. Most of it's radon, you know, and then there's some in food. And then of the remaining amount of radiation that we're exposed to, like, you know, whatever, 15%, like most of that's medical radiation, you know?
Right.
And then, you know, and there's only like, you know, the amount of radiation we're exposed to from nuclear is like 0.1%, you know? Right.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
And just changes in elevation where you live have, you know, much bigger effect on your background radiation, and there's no health effects associated with any of that. You know, we know very well that, you know, like our bodies are these like gurgling chemical factories where, like, you know, acids and bases and molecules are transforming and breaking down, and little free radicals are popping around everywhere all the time, and DNA is breaking and being repaired all the time and things like that. And you know, those tiny amounts of radiation that we receive, our bodies have lived with and evolved to handle for a long time. And those repair like everything that needs repair in our cells and our DNA, you know, there's a lot more repair happening just because of our metabolism than there is any radiation effects and things like that, you know. So I've never been one to be very confident, you know, in some of those alternative hypotheses that small amounts of radiation are actually good for you. But there are plausible theories like that out there. It could be true. It has been shown to kind of boost your repair mechanisms, but, you know, all these tiny small effects, they're always hard to prove. But what we can say is low dose radiation isn't bad for you. Like, we do know that, but we don't treat it that way, unfortunately, you know.
Well, right. And this is another thing where I feel like my mind got blown open, like, because again, I didn't really understand radiation. I just sort of figured like, oh, these things go in and they like break your cells apart and it causes cancer, right? But then, like, as I've been learning more, it's like, well, actually what happens is as I understand it, is it kind of goes in and it creates like a free radical. And then that free radical basically, kind of breaks apart your DNA or whatever. And if it happens, if you get acute radiation, then that can like
large amounts that
can really damage you. But it's honestly the same mechanisms. It's the same mechanism as we get from being exposed to oxygen, right? Like being like creatures that breathe oxygen. The oxygen like causes free radicals in our bodies. And so the same mechanism that repairs our bodies because we breathe oxygen are the same mechanisms that repair our bodies because we're exposed to radiation, and we're exposed to radiation.
That's kind of what I was getting at with like the chemical soup in our body.
Exactly.
Like these free radicals, they're just OH minuses and H pluses. They're the acid and base parts of water, basically, and those are always zipping around, breaking apart, recombining, doing a little damage, things like that.
Right. Yeah. And it seems like, like you mentioned at some point, like, flying on airplanes. I mean, if you do fly on an airplane, you get exposed to like way more cosmic radiation, than you do, down on the ground. And it's kind of like getting a dose of, it's a bigger dose of radiation than you would get from, being near a nuclear plant, for example. So yeah, no, it's super interesting. One of the things I heard that I thought was so fascinating, you mentioned like plutonium, is like this, the person was saying that you could hold plutonium in your hand and be completely fine, because the radiation it puts out is also, it's not very radioactive, and it's the kind of radiation, is it like alpha rays or something that are so weak that a piece of paper can stop them, right?
Right. The dead layer of skin on your body stops them, right?
Yeah.
So alpha, all the heavy emitters, the alpha particle ones, they're only internal threats if they're inside you.
Right. So you would actually have to,
which is the same as like lead or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So like a big block of plutonium. I mean, if you had it sitting in your house, like it wouldn't hurt you, right? Like it's only if you like.
More so uranium. Plutonium's a little worse than uranium, but uranium's the common fuel and what we really usually talk about. But yeah, I mean, depleted uranium, like the U-238 isotope that's left over from processing nuclear fuel, it's so inert that they use it as a counterweight for forklifts even, it's a very heavy material, heavier than lead or other things like that. And so it's a, there's uses for it elsewhere. So, just to change subject a little bit, one thing that, I think about sometimes, and folks sometimes tell us, like, we have these conversations like this, and what are some of the like kind of positive visions for the future that we might see that involve nuclear power. And I'm testing this out. Like I'm kind of getting used to having these conversations, but it's interesting when we look at all our movies and all our science fiction, you might see some solar panels and wind turbines in them, but every single piece of our science fiction has some sort of high density energy source. That's amazing. Like Iron Man has the arc reactor, Star Trek has dilithium crystals, who knows what they use in Star Wars. Right. It's something like you can't power spaceships, you can't power high energy lifestyles only with wind and solar. They're good complements for sure, and that's where you get into the climate justice type stuff too. Like in America, we definitely have room to lower our per capita energy and material use for sure, but it still needs to be somewhat high in the long term, and tons of people live in energy poor areas where energy is absolutely shown to improve quality of life, standard of life. So in the US, we need to cut our energy use as we can. But with all this electrification you're talking about, people don't understand that we need, even with aggressive energy efficiency measures that are captured in the CLCPA, like our energy use is going to double, triple, quadruple still as we get rid of all our transportation fuels, go to electricity, all our heating fuels go to electricity, So we still need a lot more electricity, and some people want to shut down our biggest source of carbon-free electricity.
Right. Well, and it's interesting, like, because one of the things I learned too was that, one of the early presidents or, head of the Sierra Club was very pro-nuclear, because he was anti-hydro, because hydro was flooding all of these beautiful valleys in the West, and the beauty of nuclear is it's so dense, like you could have like a 10-acre site, you can produce enough electricity, to power a small city. And you mentioned like all the
land
developing
conservation.
What's that? Yeah. So and obviously we need to preserve land for both for the animals who live there, and for the ability to grow food, and so we can't, in some ways the most environmental thing we could do, it'd be, to power the developing world with nuclear power and not have to destroy all of the, we're cutting down the rainforest in the Amazon, right? To grow palm oil, it's just crazy.
Big forests of palm oil.
Yeah.
But Nick is back.
I'm back. Briefly,
Yeah.
I'm back. I want to jump in here really quickly. We're getting close to running out of time.
Yep.
But so far this has been really, really wonderful. I'm so grateful to both of you. Even though you basically told me that there are about 1,000 new things that I need to be afraid of in my everyday life and even in my home. But to wrap this up, I do want to touch on one part that I don't think we've yet talked about. And that's, I think there is a really big concern around waste and what do we do with nuclear waste? So I want to pose the question of, one, what are the options and how do we know that it's not going to cause a bigger problem down the line? Do we know that at all? And I guess just to tease that out just a little bit more, how does that compare to waste in the life cycle of more traditional renewables?
Right. Well, one thing I will say, because they said if you take all the nuclear waste that's ever been produced, put it on a football field, it would be like 20 feet deep, right? And if you took, and that's in the entire world, like would all fit on the
US, but
okay, but it basically it would all fit on a football field. And then if you took all of the coal, or coal ash that had ever been produced and put it on that same football field, it would be 650 miles high, So that's just worth considering, and people are freaked out that all this waste is sitting at the nuclear facilities where it was produced. But honestly, there's a lot of people who think that's the safest place for it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, nuclear plants have great security, where else would you want it, in the short term? In other fields, this whole like producer responsibility idea is gaining traction where, if you produce batteries, if you produce electronics that are harmful when they go to the landfill, you need to take them back and like charge for that in your, so we see more, it's easier to give batteries back, things like that. Well, the nuclear industry's been doing that since its very beginning. All nuclear power plants, all utilities, they pay a fee for every unit of energy for nuclear fuel disposal. And so there's literally billions of dollars sitting in this fund, and just the US government hasn't drummed up the political will to create a repository to store this. So I would say in the short term, nuclear waste is perfectly safe on site and on-site storage. The U.S. Department of Energy is pursuing what they call consent-based siting for new potential nuclear spent nuclear fuel sites. So one of the kind of lessons learned from Yucca Mountain was that it was a little too top down. They didn't work with multiple different communities on the education aspect, on what the benefits like a facility like that could bring there. And like you're saying, a lot of people, once they really understand and see the opportunities and see the safety, they're far less opposed to it. So those are major kind of happenings, I guess, on nuclear spent fuel. Yeah.
And there's also, so I think the first is to not be as afraid of it as people are. But there are technologies out there. There are like fast reactors, which can actually take that waste and use it as fuel. So it doesn't work in the style of reactors that we have the most of now, but there are reactors that could use that and continue to basically burn that fuel and make it less and less and less. So that's one thing. And then you've got, and again, I don't understand all the different types of reactors. And there's also like breeder reactors that would kind of basically produce new fuel, as they go. And, and so if we weren't so opposed to nuclear and we were encouraging it and encouraging the development of the industry and convert and not over, I say this because it sounds very, sounds very unenvironmentalist of me, but
he's about to say over-regulate.
I would say that the nuclear industry is probably regulated more than it needs to be because people are so fearful of it, right? And we need to make it a little less. We need to make it a little bit easier to innovate and actually build the stuff. And that's true, I think, of a lot of things in our country. We can't build housing, even though we need a ton of housing because of all of the problems there. So, there are people who are doing some thoughts about this, about how do we get better at building infrastructure. And this is one of the pieces of infrastructure we have to get better at building. And we got to do it as quickly as we can, because it really is a solution to a problem that we're all very concerned about. Because, the biggest danger to us is out of control global warming, right? And when that gets, when the feedback loops start and we get beyond the point where we can even put the genie back in the bottle, that's what's going to have the most harm. And that's what's going to lead to the most deaths in the world. And, I think nuclear is probably the safest, form of energy, of power production that there is. But, well, I'll just put it at that.
Yeah, it's this weird catch-22. I think people are generally aware that we're not making the progress on climate change that we need to, but at the same time, we keep getting messages like, oh, the cost of wind and solar are so low, they'll displace fossil fuels anytime, but it's not a one-for-one energy. It's we need energy when we need it, not just whenever the sun and wind is out there, So, so there's these kind of false narratives out there that that kind of take away that urgency. But we really haven't talked about advanced nuclear reactors, and like you said, those fast reactors that use much more of the fuel content that produce even less waste. And a really exciting topic on that front is in Kemmerer, Wyoming, they are moving forward plans to install such an advanced nuclear reactor to replace a coal plant that's closing, and that's the TerraPower Natrium.
Yep.
And it is a fast reactor. It does burn much more of the nuclear fuel than existing types. That technology has been around for a long time, but like you said, when there's an anti-nuclear kind of sentiment out there, we haven't been advancing that technology the way we definitely could. So that's something that's encouraging. And, Bill Gates sunk a lot of his money into that company. So I think that's a really effective use of money for climate there,
And I will say too, I know there's a lot of people who cut their teeth in the environmental movement by opposing or shutting down nuclear power plants, right? There are people who that was their introduction to the environmental movement, and I understand that it would be a lot of cognitive dissonance to suddenly change that. But I would encourage people to really take a look at it. I think the younger environmentalists who are coming up, climate activists who don't have that legacy are way more open to the idea of nuclear energy. And I would encourage people to try to, to think like a young climate activist, and look at the facts, and look at the history, and not and admit that maybe we were misled, because I think we were. I think all of us who have been in the environmental movement for a long time were, I believe, misled by nuclear fear. And there's a ton of good information out there. There's a ton of TED Talks and YouTube videos. I mean, Michael Schellenberger has some really great TED Talks, and I would encourage people to look him up.
The Decouple podcast is a good one.
That's one of my
Chris
favorite
Kiefer, he's a medical doctor in Canada, and he was the founder of Doctors for Nuclear.
Yep.
We didn't talk about air pollution and all. There's so many things to talk about.
Yeah, but Decouple is a great one. And like I said, Jerry Thomas, she's got some great information out there about the health effects. I mean, there's if you go looking, you'll like me, your mind will be blown open. Like, wow, everything I thought I knew was wrong, honestly,
And in this day and age, it's heartening to hear people being open-minded and changing their mind. I feel like people don't do that much. It's important keeping them.
Well, maybe we could get a chapter of stand up for nuclear here. That's like that. Environmental progress, or environmental progress. Is that the name of that organization?
Yeah. We did. I led one on the Commons last year. So
all right, cool.
I didn't know to tell you about it.
Well, now you do, and we can maybe after this one we can get we can get 10 more people there.
There you go. Yeah, a professor from Cornell came out. He studies nuclear fusion, but he very in support of nuclear fission. So it's great to have a little bit of Cornell folks there too.
Yeah. Well, very cool. Well, Ethan, it's really great to make your acquaintance and know that there's at least one pro-nuclear activist out there.
Exactly. I was like, oh, there's another one. Yeah. And, it's encouraging to hear Luis talking about it, and that's why we're doing these conversations, right, Rebecca? So thank you.
Yeah, totally. And I guess just to recap, dangers everywhere, and nuclear is not necessarily one of those dangers. Our bodies are amazing at mitigating these hazards, and you could have a chunk of uranium in your home if you wanted, and it might not be that bad. And maybe what we're taking from this is that nuclear could be a viable alternative, either locally or regionally. Interested to hear what our audience thinks, so please do let us know in the comments or reach out. Thank you both, Ethan and Dan, so much for taking the time out of your day to do this. We're so appreciative.
It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, it's fun.
Really looking forward to more conversations about nuclear.
Yeah. Well, this is going to be the most popular one of these yet, I'm sure.
Let's hope, right?
One way or another, yeah.
Famous, infamous, I'll take either.
Oh.
All right, well, thank you both, and thank you to our audience for tuning in, and we will see you next time.